I wanted to come on here and shed a little bit of light on this whole trend or notion of the Swirl Nation. I also wanted to talk about a few options for Black people to consider. But before I break down all of the problems with this whole Swirl Nation, I want to frame this whole thing with the proper context so this picture is vividly clear. Okay? First, you have to understand that most of the previous IR relationships were done from a premise of rebellion to some degree. What this means is because of the taboo nature of it all at that time, you could easily conclude that the majority of it happened primarily with people with a higher propensity for adverse risk taking behavior. I'm talking behavior typically associated with like the lower IQ partition of any given group that participated for that matter. Because I mean, it wasn't really that smart of an idea to engage in at that time. Um, this is what we saw in Louisiana with the whole Creole and various other mulatto populations throughout the country. While this union did add a lot of genetic diversity in the bloodline of most native born African Americans in the US, it did not change our economic situation to any varying degree. Most of the reason for this is because prior to the 21st century, the biracial considered himself to be black. Most biracials still married black. They were also cultured to be black in most instances. Even the phenotypically white passing biracials considered themselves to be black. Most black folk thought this was solely due to the one drop rule, which is not the full truth. If you read much of the literature of accounts from the 17th to the 18th century, you will see that how this whole biracial dynamic really played out in white society, not just black society. You know, from our perspective, it was the one drop rule, but from their perspective, it was something totally different. One book in particular made many interesting statements regarding this issue. The name of the book is American Slave Coast: A History of Slave Breeding Industry by Ned Sublet and Constance Sublet. You will find that while many people back then believed blacks and whites to be just simply separate species, others believed us to be totally different animals completely. They believed the mixture of black and white would result in some mutational deformity of some sort, either presented at that time or later down the line generationally. Of course, today with science, we know that not to be true. Another interesting term from the book was the partus sequitur ventrum term. It was a legal term that meant the status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. The father passed down inheritance, and the mother passed down slavery. This was done to ensure a steady flow of human product from the womb of women who had no legal right to say no. And in reality, it was done as a shield from the embarrassment associated with white men indulging in social improprieties with black slave women at that time. Now, this current IR union will result in a completely different outcome in terms of the progeny it will produce. Now, the first thing is we have to recognize this. See, the 21st century biracial, they will no longer be black. Okay? You have to get this. They will, for the first time in American history, be actually considered biracial. I would also conclude that the more phenotypically white passing biracials will most likely, for the first time, more than anything, identify and operate as simply white, especially when it's most advantageous to do so. Now, you would think that, hey, this is a good thing, multiculturalism, kumbaya, oh, happy days. Yeah, okay. This is natural matriculation. All right. But this is the problem. You see, whenever we discuss issues pertaining to any form of race mixing, wealth gaps, overall prosperity, the next question you have to impart in the discussion centers around IQ and genetic diversity. This tends to be a subject that black folks want to run from, like, I'm not dumb, or they tend to deflect or intellectually try to, invalidate the data. Me personally, I say why? Like, why do that? Um, this is valuable information. One thing I do like about the natural disposition of most black folks, contrary to popular belief, black folks are very monolithic in terms of our belief patterns. Like our voting patterns reflect this ostensibly. Our parenting patterns and trends kind of reflect this. Our general compassion for the thuggish behavior. The odd thing is, if you ask most of the upwardly mobile blacks if this were true, most would probably lie about it oddly enough. And then 5 minutes later, you'll hear them hopping in there, right in their car, banging out to some Lil Wayne talking about killing niggas. The irony, right? But I actually think these traits, to a certain degree, are good. The reason this is good is because I believe if, keyword if, we were more overtly educated on the matters of IQ differences, I believe black folks could, if any other group could fix it, I believe we could fix it. We could fix this problem because we will tackle the issue, I believe. And if we can propagandize it into a cultural movement, I believe we can knock it out. Seriously. Human evolutionary development is something that native born blacks are not new to. I mean, genetic manipulation was done during slavery. If you look at many of the newer Africans that come here and compare just the sheer athleticism of the new ones with the native American born blacks, there's not much of a comparison in terms of just athleticism and physical prowess. I believe through breeding, native born American blacks were bred to be more physically dominant than any other group of humans on the planet, including native born Africans. You got to understand that the slave trade was often very brutal. Many of the weaker slaves just didn't make it. Only the physically strong were even given the opportunity to make it to the market for sale. This was even prior to them being bred for strength on some plantations that they would arrive to after purchase. Brutal environmental conditions tend to strengthen the resolve of any given group of people. I mean, most theorists attribute the higher IQ of white people simply to the harsher conditions of Europe at that time. Through the process of natural selection, only the most intelligent were able to survive and pass down their DNA to the next generation. In sharp contrast, if you juxtapose that for blacks who essentially grew up in the metaphorical Garden of Eden in Africa, I mean, this was a tropical climate where food was plentiful. I mean, we weren't planning, you having to use teamwork or savagery. That kind of stuff just wasn't necessary for basic survival. So essentially, Pookies and Ray Rays was simply just passing out babies like crab cakes. I mean, it was just like a free for all. Now, I know a lot of y'all are probably wondering, okay, where is he going with this? And how am I going to tie all this together? But bear with me. I always bring it home. I always bring it home. All right? Okay, so genetic diversity. A lot of people don't know much about genetic diversity. So I'm going to really lay out the definition and paint a real detailed picture of how this process takes place. So, genetic diversity within a population refers to the number of different alleles, the alternate forms of genes of all genes, and the frequency with which they appear. So, variation is high when there's many different alleles of all genes and many different combinations of those genes. All right. So, simply put, genetic diversity plays an important role in the survival and adaptability of a species. Okay. So, it's important with survival, keyword, remember this, and adaptability for one. So when a population's habitat changes, the population may have to adapt to survive. The ability of the population to adapt to the changing environment will determine their ability to cope with environmental change and stressors. Key word, okay? Now, so what's going on today in America? Okay? Currently in America, the biggest beneficiaries of swirling is not native born blacks. You have to take heed to this, okay? We already have high levels of genetic diversity. Africa alone is one of the most genetically diverse continents on the entire planet. And so, according to genetic data from 23andMe, the average African American genome, for example, and this is the average, is only about 73.2% African. We're about 24% European and 0.8% Native American. Now, this is a report from the American Journal of Human Genetics. Also, meanwhile, Latinos, meanwhile, carry an average of 18% Native American ancestry, 65.1% European ancestry, mostly from the Iberian Peninsula, and 6.2% African ancestry. Now, listen to this though. Only 4% of European Americans carry any African ancestry, okay? Which is a very small amount. Now listen to this again. Only 4% of all the European Americans carry any African ancestry, okay? So genetic diversity is not our issue. Our problem is what I call regressive cultural adaptation and very, 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 very regressive breeding practices. I mean, whites also have growing regressive breeding practices nowadays as well. And to compound that, they have, on average, much less genetic diversity as well. So, genetic diversity, again, plays an important role in the survival, okay, and adaptability, keyword adaptability of a species. So when a population's habitat changes, the population may have to adapt to survive. The ability of the population to adapt to changing environments will determine their ability to cope with environmental challenges and stressors. Okay? So, and that brings me to these hunting trends and statistics. Currently, for the last couple of decades, white middle aged mortality rates have skyrocketed. The main cause of the spike in death rates among American whites are what the authors are calling deaths of despair, stemming from primarily drug and alcohol abuse, suicide, keyword adaptability, remember that, and a slowdown in the progress made against diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, two of the largest killers in the US, primarily among the lower educated whites in America. More white Americans are now dying than being born in a third of the US states, according to the most recent studies, which shows white deaths outpacing births in a record 17 states stretching from California all the way to Maine. I mean, the white population isn't replacing itself, stated by Ken Johnson, a University of New Hampshire demographer and co author of this study. Okay? Also, we're having issues with jobs. The jobs are leaving overseas. They are not able to work. Therefore, babies are being born out of wedlock. The marriage rates are plummeting rapidly, just like in Black America, but the coping is not as good. Okay? Today, most African Americans are actually optimistic about the future in America, when the opposite is true for white Americans. And you would think, why, when the wealth gap is so abysmal when it comes to whites versus blacks? One commentator noted that equality for whites feels more like oppression, while equality for blacks feels more like progression. It's really odd how that works out. Then, when you couple that with the current fact that most all immigrants are outperforming native whites in the UK, including many of the poor refugee black Africans. You see, many bloggers and commentators came up with countless explanations for the unexpected trend among blacks from Africa who were expected to be around two standard deviations, or let's just say 30 IQ points below whites in average IQ scores. But the hereditarian and demographer camps could not have been more wrong. In fact, what most scholars and bloggers in the IQ world seem to not know is that by the time these pieces of news were coming out in the media, there were already African students that were overtaking the white average GCSE scores by significant margins. The problem was that they were lumping all the Africans into one big racial group when other groups were being identified by nationalities, such as like Chinese, Indian, Pakistan, etc., rather than like just blanket statements like Asian or Southeast Asian, etc. So grouping Africans into a monolith like Black African ethnicity concealed the different experiences of African immigrants from different nations, some of whom had immigrated as refugees from war torn countries, while others from countries that didn't speak as much English. So, therefore, they were kind of disadvantaged on some of these initial tests. As the table right here shows, some African nationalities, particularly the Ghanaians and the Nigerians, score way above the England mean and the white British mean, while others like the Somali and the Congolese score way below, but still not as low as the Portuguese immigrants. You see, but most of the low scoring African groups are the ones that migrated as refugees and or could not speak English, on top of being very, very poor. Improvements among the Somalis have been impressive, though, especially due to the programs dedicated to teaching them English. Now, the Chinese and the Indians are still very conspicuously above even the best African nationalities. But their superiority seems to rapidly disappear when the Nigerians are broken down further according to their different tribal ethnicities. You see, groups like the famous Igbo tribe are well known to be high academic achievers in Nigeria. In fact, their performance seems to be at least as high as the model minority Chinese and Indians in the UK. Also, according to the daily report on the GCSE results of 2010, the best student in the whole country was indeed a Nigerian girl, Chidra Atta, who was of Igbo descent. Atta scored higher than any Chinese, Indian, or white student, and higher than any student from any of the prestigious schools, including Elton College as well. I mean, to put this in perspective, these results mean that the children of Black Africans, or at least the West Africans, are not only not scoring below the scores of the low IQ poor white children, as Jensen's calculations would have predicted, but they're outscoring the children of elite whites as well. I mean, it's just something to be said about that. You know, high emphasis on sports or the need for like diversity are just not that important in UK universities as they are in American universities, or at least in practice they aren't. But this is why two of the most elite universities like Oxford, Cambridge, they don't feel too pressured to take in blacks or any other group solely on the basis of impressive GCSE scores. The spokeswoman of Oxford simply admitted that there are many more blacks that are academically qualified to enter their university each year than are accepted. She explained that one of the main reasons they don't accept as many blacks as would be expected is because they tend to over apply in subjects such as economics and management, medicine, and math. But when you think about it, could you imagine the spokesperson from Harvard University coming out to explain they couldn't take but a small portion of blacks with top SAT scores because too many of them are applying to STEM courses? I mean, the irony is that a lot of that is happening today in America with a lot of Asian students, unfortunately. You know, now that I've laid all of that out, I've given you all of this information that ties all of this together. I want to first say this: I am not a swirl hater. Like, that's not me. So, miss me with all of that. Like, I'm not that guy. But what I do not like is the overt promotion of the swirl. Why? Okay. For one, because it doesn't benefit black folks. It only benefits white folks at our detriment in this current juncture of time. Now, I'm going to give you the reasons why. You see, remember that whole genetic diversity piece? Also, you must understand this: Africa is currently the most genetically diverse continent on the entire planet right now. Okay? And see, to the layperson who doesn't have a deep enough grasp of knowledge of genetic variation, they look at Africa as one big continent of black people. What they don't take into account is the thousands of different types of black folks in that particular continent. See, what we have to do is just simply tap into what the intellectually successful and the physically dominant tribes did to become that way. And I have. But first, I want to show you what the Swirl Nation looks like in 2 to 3 generations if fully implemented to give you just a little bit of the gravity of the situation that we face right here in this country. So, I was able to compile some data from the US Census. I only used a cohort of reproductive age people from the US from ages 15 to 54. Okay. And that total of people is about 170, basically about 171 million people. All right. Now, this is the kicker. Right now in America, all it would take, and now this is just from that age group. This is not all of white America, okay? This is just from that age group from 15 to 54. All it would take is 19.3% of white men for all of the black women in that age and 18.1% of white women for black men to completely genetically annihilate black folk in this country. That's all it takes. Right? Now, imagine we close the border and only black folk, white folk, and, I guess the rest of the immigrants in this country as well. But I'm just saying, you have to listen to this. 19.3% of white men for black women and 18.1% of white women for black men. And it's a wrap for black folk in this country. I mean, just think about it. One could easily argue that this small group of whites could genetically annihilate black folks in this country in no more than 1 to 2 generations if fully implemented. I mean, the likelihood of this taking place is obviously low, but the major point of this demonstration is to show you how few whites it would actually take for this type of undertaking to take place. I mean, the average native born black is already about 25% European anyway. Now, what is most likely to take place in the 21st century swirl is very similar to this demonstration, but in many ways more dire. You see, you don't have to look much further than what is happening currently in Africa, with its best and brightest leaving the country and not coming back, causing massive brain drains. The same thing is likely to take place in the 21st century swirl. You see, the best and brightest will most likely participate in swirling, leaving the underperforming blacks back in the hood. You see, as the amalgamation of cultures, race, and ethnicity increases, people are going to be more apt to date based on natural similarities such as IQ, interest, sexual attraction, and so on. You see, racial exclusions without external influences will play less and less of an active role in the exclusion in the vetting process. As a result, people are just going to simply date based on character over color, to put it simply. You see, the problem with this is that there are far more whites than blacks. There are also far more whites with higher IQs on average, which means well more than enough to date all of the higher IQ blacks and more, all leading to a seismic brain drain of devastating proportions. And the progeny or the children of this union will be also problematic as well. And I'm going to explain why. You see, because the 21st century biracial will not only have no allegiance to black folks, remember, they will no longer be considered just black, but now biracial. You see, it's a difference. And they will also have an on average higher IQ because of the brain drain. You see, even the black mom and dad will most likely have a higher IQ, as well as the white spouse that they choose to be with. As a result, the children will be less relatable to the average leftover blacks in the hood. So even if they wanted to date blacks, many simply just won't relate. Not only on an intellectual level, but from a financial level as well. You see, the overall wealth of experiences typically awarded to people of higher socioeconomic classes are vastly different from someone in the hood. So let's think about this. As this amalgamation continues, the talented blacks are going to date out, and the lower IQ blacks are not. This will create an even less performing group of blacks overall. further exacerbating the already gaping disparities in almost every achievement gap focused on group performance. Understand this. I mean, from this, it's easy to conclude that the 21st century biracial is simply just going to either date white or biracial, but most likely white. You know, a lot of people think that race relations are getting worse in America, and I could not disagree more. I don't think race relations are getting worse at all. What we are witnessing is more of a racial realignment and racial truth being exposed. We are confronting like many of the taboos that people will kind of keep in the closet or in the confines of their homes. A lot of these things are just kind of spilling out into society as a whole. So the country is kind of reassessing the need for many governmental policy advantages for certain groups over others. You know, we're looking at accountability for actions for certain groups. We're also pushing for more real equality on both sides of the divide, both black and white. And we're trying to seek the highest level of fairness and justice. So we are also culturally blending at rapid rates, all while confronting differences simultaneously. I believe the pressure from the racial merger is what we're feeling, and we're confusing that as racial tension. Therefore, as I study the trends, I don't think we're going into like a post racial society, nor do I even believe that to be practical or even possible. Okay, so I do believe what we're going to see is more of a racial casting system take place where wealth consolidation, power, and influence will be the greatest indication of racial status. So, what do I mean by that? See, your race is more and more going to be predicated on your overall socioeconomic status. You see, people will forever have the biases for the other, the quote unquote other. Race is just a convenient distinction for the quote unquote other classification. But as genetic testing becomes more prevalent, the notion of the quote unquote other will be more and more ambiguous, which will mark the beginning of a more regional or ethnic caste that will be primarily predicated on things like religion, politics, wealth, and so on. I would jokingly say to like one of my buddies back in the day that, if it was only white people on the planet, they would figure out a way to have the blue eyes hate the green eyes. I mean, the fear of the other is so ubiquitous in the predisposition of the human condition. I don't think much of that will ever really change. But I do believe that the implementation of the fear of the quote unquote other will evolve beyond the superficial characteristics. So, what does all of this mean for black folks? Okay, I'm going to tell you. You see, the Jews manipulated nature by arranging marriages, whether unbeknownst to them or not, for high IQ. Similar to the way Jewish surgeons in the 1850s would have much higher efficacy rates than many of their counterparts with their patients simply due to washing their hands between surgeries. I mean, today, Jews have some of the highest recorded IQs on the planet, and that is not accidental, people. China recently abolished legal arranged marriages as early as 1950, but even though forced arranged marriages are today considered illegal, parents still play a major active role in choosing the spouses for their children. Now, the irony is since they've stopped, marriage rates and birth rates have been rapidly declining in recent decades. You see, they didn't have this problem when arranging marriages was legal. They were also probably able to increase the overall IQ of the population as well, even if the high achievers predominated primarily at the upper tier partitions of the population. While doing an interview in Nigeria, Abib was asked, how prevalent are arranged marriages in the Igbo tribe out there in Nigeria? And his response was basically this: both arranged marriages and grooms finding their own brides are tolerated. For more traditional people, the arranged marriages are still commonplace. A lot of them new modern people are trying to go the way of the Western process by falling in love and that whole deal. But for the most part, it's still very commonplace for arranged marriages to take place. So what we're witnessing in all of these groups is a common theme: stable arrangement of marriages and or stable families, period, with a heavy emphasis on educational achievement and discipline. Whites, in contrast to many other groups, experienced a much different evolutionary process. Due to the harsh environmental factors and constant wars between varying groups, the weaker and lesser intellectually evolved groups just simply died out. They couldn't compete. So My question overall is this: what are we going to do to survive? I mean, I just laid out all of the blueprints. Rampant female sexual freedom or liberation, whatever you want to call it, I mean, that just simply does not work. I mean, it only oversaturates the female sexual marketplace with free sex that leave men with no real incentive to commit or settle. I mean, greater supply always equals less demand. You have to remember that, ladies. You have to remember more supply, less demand. I argue if female sexual liberation has ever worked for any successful group of people anywhere on the planet. I don't believe so. At least I haven't seen it. If you have, please let me know in the comment section. These successful groups are only able to beat the odds and outcompete everybody because they're able to prearrange the outcomes. I mean, one plus one equals two. I mean, please let me know what you think about this. I want to hear your solutions to these problems. So please leave a comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know what you think. All right, peace.